Joining us on our panel today, we have the CEO of State Library Victoria, Kate Torney. Hello, Kate.
Hi, nice to be here.
Lovely to have you with us and great to see you again after many years. We used to work together a long time ago. Chris Buckingham is with us, the President of Public Libraries Victoria. Chris, nice to have you with us.
Hello.
Thanks for agreeing to come on our panel today. And of course, as usual, we have the CEO of the VLGA, Kathryn Arndt. Hi, Kathryn.
Hi, Chris.
We wanted to spend some time today talking about how public libraries are responding to the COVID-19 world. We've seen lots of great stories about the way libraries have adapted. We've also seen some stories about how particularly council staff have been redeployed to different areas because services have undergone some significant change, understandably. So firstly, Kate, perhaps we could ask you firstly to talk to us about what the impact has been on how you run the State Library during COVID-19.
Well, it's been dramatic, and I think when I look back to the day that we had a staff meeting, which now seems incredible, you know, staff in the same room together, and we talked about closing the library, and I think Chris would agree, but it goes against the grain for libraries because often in times of crisis or disaster, the library is the hub, the library is the glue that sticks a community together. And so for the State Library, you know, it was a massive decision, as well as I'm sure for public libraries around the state. And also for our teams. Our teams are used to helping people. And so what I found in those first few weeks, this beautiful focus, if you like, on how teams could continue to provide a service in lockdown. And so I've been incredibly proud of the State Library team in very quickly, I hate the word, but pivoting to think about what services could we offer. And most importantly, and I think this is one of the great traits of libraries and library teams, really quickly thinking about what the new need was. So not trying to replicate services that were relevant in a pre-COVID world, but really trying to think about, well, what does the community need from us now? What is everyone else offering? I think that there was a rush to do really kind of interesting things online in terms of the glam sector. But I think if you look at libraries came back to first principles and really poured their resources and their focus into what they uniquely could deliver for the communities that they know so well. And I think that was exactly the same with the State Library. So we focused very initially on our people, on making sure that our staff and our teams were safe, that they had made the transition to working from home as easily as possible. And so our focus unashamedly was on our teams for that first couple of weeks. And then we started to really look at, well, what value could we add during this period? And so that's been everything from, you know, thinking through access to collections and access to, you know, discussions with publishers about lifting copyright around some of the access, which has been absolutely fantastic, to also thinking through, well, what some of our programming, could we transfer that to an online service, getting an Ask a Librarian service up, and really thinking through what the library looks like digitally.
I know Kathryn's got a question, but I just want to pick up a point you've just made there, Kate, about talking to publishers about lifting copyright. That's a really interesting point that I hadn't considered. What were those conversations like? Were they easy to have?
Amazing. You know, so Ancestry.com, for example, is a really great example of a fantastic partnership that they've entered into with the library sector. So, you know, we know that family history is a really big service that the library offers, and so those conversations were really terrific. So, you know, I think all in all, there's been such goodwill through this process, and so those conversations were really terrific. And I think it would be great to be able to now continue those conversations, because I think we're, you know, when we open the doors, life is not going to be the same. We get, you know, we used to get 7,000 people in the library every day. That's not going to be a post-COVID world. And so I think it would be great to be able to continue some of the conversations, and Chris will have views on this, some of the conversations that recognise that there will be large sections of the community that will need and will want and will feel a level of concern about, you know, getting back out into the big wide world. And so can we continue some of the agreements that we've set up in this really extraordinary time?
Yeah.
Mm. And Chris, I'd be really interested to hear from you what some of the differences in responses have been with your member libraries.
It's been really interesting, Kathryn, in terms of, and I guess we know that local government is the layer of government that's closest to community, and you know, good local government is one that reflects its community and indeed the needs of its community. And I think we've seen that across the state. Public libraries, I think there's 270 odd public libraries across the state, and they each serve an individual community. And so to that end, what we've seen, I think, is a really varied response in both in terms of quality, but also in terms of responding to community need. We've seen some rural services close completely, and indeed staff being stood down. And then some of the larger metropolitan services are probably being able to navigate it either because they've got more resources or more scope for innovation, have been able to navigate it more successfully. And what I hope that comes out of this is a better understanding that the sector as a whole needs to be supported by state and local government to a certain level, to a certain standard that sees us actually deliver on the promise around social and economic inclusion and digital inclusion in particular.
So how, I guess, have the libraries adapted? How are they delivering their services differently in this environment?
It's been quite incredible, and I think it's probably, you know, the big contrast between us as local services and, say, for example, the State Library is that quite clearly the State Library had a need to close immediately because of the sheer volume of people that were coming through, and obviously a very high profile location with international students and the like, and so probably deemed to be in a fairly sort of high risk sort of environment. Whereas I think, bless them, but I think library services in many respects just continue to work and innovate in ways that allow them to work within the guidance of the state government directives around closure and limitation restrictions on service until they were absolutely told to close. And even then I'd argue there was some resistance about that. And then when we won the concession to commence collection management back in branch, we've seen services come up with really clever ways of not only keeping their staff gainfully employed, but delivering service back to community. And some of those things, Kate's already mentioned, you know, the digital piece around online and virtual programming and access to e-resources, but also, you know, home deliveries run by couriers because librarians aren't allowed to deliver, those sorts of things. And we're seeing community respond beautifully in terms of, you know, what is really, frankly, a limited service now, but appreciating just the sheer commitment that library people have to actually supporting their community in this difficult time.
Fantastic.
Can I take you back to the staffing issue? Chris, you mentioned some councils have had to stand down staff. There's stories of staff across council services being redeployed into other areas simply because the service need exists somewhere else. Kate, what's the impact been on your staff? You don't have, I assume, the capacity to take staff and put them into other departments because you're a standalone entity, am I right?
Well, there are a few things around that. What we have been able to do is quite quickly, we had a very small group of a team together to identify two things: the services that we needed to deliver to the community now, but also the work that we might be able to redirect some staff members to that we could continue while in closure. And in fact, you know, work that a closure gave us an opportunity to focus on when in fact, you know, it was probably not work that we do on a business as usual state. And look, the one thing I think I'm really conscious of in comparison to the position that Chris and his teams are in, the state government very quickly identified for the cultural agencies that we would have our funding, our status quo funding rolled over until December, which was extraordinary because it just meant that we were able to look at a budget without having to address any sort of budget cuts. We will, I have no doubt, and the discussions are already starting, that as we get to December and the budgets are reset, I have no doubt that we will be in challenging times, and we're already trying to address a budget hole. But that state government certainty was so welcomed by us and the other agencies. And so, Chris, what we've done in terms of staffing, we've tried to find meaningful work for as many staff as possible, and that's been pretty easy to do. We've also recognised that it's really hard to work from home for a lot of people, whether or not that's connectivity issues, whether or not that's caring issues, and so we've had a number of staff during this period of time who've taken leave. And as you probably know, the state government also provided a period of special leave, which has been really welcomed by staff too. So I do know how lucky we are, and recognise just that decision making and that sense of confidence by the state government has been extraordinary. And I know that you know, the goodwill that has created across the public sector. We also know that we need to work really hard as we start to budget around December to tighten our belts. And I think it's going to be a really hard few years. You know, we're already doing contingency planning to save a lot of money, and that's a bit depressing, but it's also an opportunity to say, okay, it's a different state, we're heading into a different environment, so how do we cope with that, and how do we get a bit more self-sufficient? How do we think? You know, sometimes I think we all think that there's no way of tightening the belt any more, but it's innovation. And Chris and I have talked a lot about this. You know, how does the State Library and the Public Library Victoria, how do we get a bit more savvy about identifying those opportunities that libraries really should be stepping in to take up in terms of recovery? How do we make sure that the state government and local governments know that we are really well placed to provide a lot of the services that are being thought about now? So I think it's about us getting a seat at the table now. I was part of a conversation recently, which, you know, was in which there were discussion around, you know, how to roll out some programming to support wellness, you know, in regional areas. Well, you know, hello, public libraries are so well placed to do that. They know their communities. They've been involved in that for years anyway. So I just think sometimes governments at all levels think that we need to create new vehicles and mediums to deliver. We don't. Public libraries are there. So that's kind of what I think in the next few weeks is really important.
And just on that, Kate, and this is probably more for Chris, I know that you're involved in the advisory group of the Libraries After Dark program that the VLGA facilitates on behalf of Moreland City Council. And you may not be across it at the moment, but in this COVID-19 situation, what we're doing, the VLGA is at the moment running virtual training and upskilling professional development programs for library staff to support them in that program once we get back to a post-COVID-19 situation where libraries are actually seen as a place where people, and particularly more vulnerable members of the community, can go after dark. Libraries After Dark is particularly focused on reducing harm from gambling in the community, but of course that program is actually a lot broader than that when you think about it. The opportunity for people who may be living in isolation or alone, students who might want to go to a safe and quiet place to study. Perhaps, Chris, you might want to talk a little bit about that from your perspective.
Yeah, Kathryn, the Libraries After Dark program, it is a source of inspiration for the sector, and I think it's certainly come to the front of our thinking in terms of a broader statewide approach to how libraries can actually make a meaningful contribution to the community's recovery. And very clearly, you know, we all know that if you open libraries for longer, you get more people in them and they can stay for longer. And I think what we'll see as restrictions are eased is a pent-up demand for people to get out of their homes, but also be in a safe place where they have access to the internet, where they can just be in their community in a safe way. Public libraries are one of those few places where you can come in, smile at someone else, half expect a smile back, but not get, beaten up for starting a conversation with someone. It's an environment that encourages social inclusion and cohesion, and I think putting even just the isolation piece aside and looking at that a lot, coupled with the digital inclusion, and indeed, we're going to have a lot of people going to be looking for work.
Yeah.
Right, so if they're cash strapped, they don't have internet, they don't have access to a PC, where are they going to get that? They're going to get that at the library. And I think therefore one of the things we're looking at very seriously is as we approach state government for increased funding through the budget process, and we appreciate how hard it'll be for the state government to respond positively to that. But I think one of the very clear things that we can demonstrate is that if we open for longer, if we're funded to open for longer, we'll actually provide real tangible support for community in these difficult times.
On the technology, you just mentioned, Chris, there, the people that don't necessarily have computers or internet access at home. Right now, it occurs to me that it's for those people, it's just so important that they can remain connected some way. How are libraries dealing with that seemingly impossible issue to keep people connected when you can't open your doors?
Yeah, Chris, right now it's really hard because we're closed in every sense of the meaning, and I think one of the things we need state government to do is not have us all throw open our doors and allow hundreds of people through, but allow us to re-establish services like the free Wi-Fi, the click and collect services, just the basic stuff that mean that people can access the internet. Right now, 1 in 7 Victorian households don't have access to the internet. And guess what? Those 1 in 7 households that don't have access to the internet, the ones with kids that are struggling at school, the ones that people are looking for work, people, who may be sole operators who are, struggling to run their businesses. These are the most vulnerable in our community, and libraries with just a bit of nuanced thinking can step into that breach fairly quickly, I believe.
Kate, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think Chris is absolutely right. When I think about those most in need of libraries now, Chris has summed that up, and I think we've been talking a lot about reopening, and I've been talking to the states and national libraries around Australia about that, and some are reopening next week with limits of 10 people at a time, 20 people at a time. It's like, Willy Wonka. If you get a ticket, you're going to be bloody lucky. But in thinking through that, if that's a situation that we're facing for 1 month, 3 months, then I think Chris is absolutely right. We need to be thinking about prioritising the people who most need us. And what I love about the public library sector is that that's different in every, every different area. But public library leaders know exactly, what that priority process is. So we're certainly thinking through that. But I think Chris is right, that 1 in 7 figure is a very powerful figure. You think about what has happened in those houses and how much, just the traction that has been lost in a period of time where connectivity has been a lifeline. I think it's really important that we as a sector, we can help, and so we should be helping.
Chris, I guess we've talked a little bit about the impact for staff at the State Library. From your members' perspective, what has been the impact for the staff in the libraries?
Kathryn, it's been really varied and variable across the sector for the reasons I mentioned before. Different organisations, different forms of leadership, different communities with different needs. I see examples of library services that have gone full throttle through the entire period, finding new ways to deliver services and have staff that are probably working harder than they've worked for a long time. And indeed, from a cultural and morale point of view, absolutely rocking it. They're going great guns. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I know that there are services out there that have been stood down, that their staff are waiting at home, really struggling to understand how they're going to re-engage as a workforce and indeed reopen their services. So it's really varied, Kathryn, and I just I hope that as we all come out of this as leaders within government or within civic service, that we can pull some case studies, the good, the bad and the ugly, and actually really reflect on what could have been done differently.
Have you seen any examples of collaboration across libraries to try and address some of those issues?
Unbelievable, Kathryn. I mean, the level. The public library sector has a reputation for collaboration. In my career, I've never seen anything like the first 4 to 6 weeks of the response to this crisis in terms of the way that people were sharing information, providing support for each other. You know, library leaders were ringing each other, and because you catch up on Zoom meetings, and you can tell when somebody's having a tough time because there's a tick appearing, or things are not good.
Yeah.
So my colleagues, if they haven't shaved for a couple of days, I'll probably ring them up and say, "Hey mate, what's going on?"
Yeah.
But are you okay? But in all seriousness, the quality of the information sharing has been outstanding. The willingness for people just to simply share strategy, practice, frameworks has been consistent right throughout both the response and the recovery process to this situation. It makes me very proud to be a part of this sector.
We'll need to wrap this up soon, but there's so many things we could talk about. I wonder if I could get both of you to nominate some innovations that you've seen that are coming out of this that you'd really like to see held on to once we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. What's really impressed you as maybe a why didn't we think of that before type moment? Okay.
Well, look, there's lots that I've been thinking about, but I'm just flowing on from Chris's point. I think being mindful to hang on to the things that have worked. So I think there are massive benefits in working from home. I think that there are huge benefits in the kind of, and Chris is talking about collaboration across the sector. The library sector, I think, is so professionally generous. But what I've really loved too is the autonomy that our teams have shown, just this incredible, sense of crisis. Everyone's dealing with their own pressures at home, etc. But this sort of sense of autonomy and a lovely nurturing sort of culture that has emerged, which has meant that we've had these great ideas filtering up. And I have found, because I'm not from the library sector, I have found at times that libraries are quite hierarchical. And so sometimes those great ideas that might be, in the middle of an organisation, sometimes they're quashed before they ever get to you. I have loved this because it's like all filters are off, and it's, there are thought bubbles going left, right and centre. And in a way it's managing those that has been, the most difficult. So I think that sense of innovation and how do we harness that and really continue to encourage that. And I feel as though, in a way, we have fast-tracked a few things. We fast-tracked a cultural shift to get rid of the hierarchy. And so how do you hang on to that? I was thinking we had been through quite a significant structural change just in the lead up to the closure. And that had been a wonderful process for me, and really sort of an insight into all areas within the library. But I also think about, we did a piece, a consultation piece about some open plan office, planning. It took about 12 months to have a conversation about that. And I sort of think now, hey, we transitioned to working from home in 4 days. So come on, let's not waste time having years of consultation on things that we should really be able to decide on quickly. So I want to change that conversation too, not steamroll decisions through, but really sort of say, look, there are things that we need to do. We know we need to do them. Let's do them in a month rather than do them over, a 12-month period. So I think we've demonstrated to ourselves that we're much more innovative and agile and creative and capable. And we're much more resilient than we probably ever gave ourselves credit for. So I want to hang on to that.
That's the perfect example of that burning platform, isn't it? That you're forced to adapt and adapt quickly, and you do. Chris, one of our members wrote to us and asked if we could talk about click and collect and home deliveries, which you sort of touched on. Is that the sort of innovation you think that'll stay with us post COVID-19?
I think so, Chris. Can I just say, Kate's absolutely right around the culture and decision making and the like, and unlocking processes or getting new systems, not necessarily groundbreaking systems, quite often proven technology, and working it back into the organisation, because you put community at the front of your decision making, and it's amazing how that can actually unlock the barriers to change and innovation. But I guess to your question about home deliveries and the click and collect, I think so. I think both those services have, you know, and we're better than supermarkets, but actually what we're doing is we're following paths that have already been created for us by the commercial side of things and going, well, you know what, actually there's a demand for home delivery. Why aren't we fulfilling this in day-to-day operations? And certainly from a Casey Junior Libraries perspective, there's no doubt in my mind, as long as we can find the right model financially to keep it sustained, we'll run with home delivery, because we've got a lot of people who are time poor who never get to come to the library otherwise. We've got a library network that is physically not really meeting the needs of the growing suburbs around. So how do we make sure we get books into their hands in an equitable way? Well, home delivery might be it. And I think the same sits with click and collect as well. I think having got the systems in place within our libraries and proven that they work and proven that there's community demand, albeit both those things I think will settle into the demand as we reopen our doors properly over the coming months. I see no reason why we wouldn't embrace those things and then look for new ways of doing things, possibly ahead of the supermarkets instead of just behind them.
Yeah, agree. Great point.
Yeah.
Kathryn, final thoughts from you?
Yes, look, I think I'd be neglect in not asking whether or not the new Local Government Act has any impact on the library services from your perspective. I've liked that we're focused on innovation though in this conversation, but getting back to the legislative arm, what's your thoughts on that, Chris?
I think the big thing for libraries in the new Local Government Act is the gradual abolition of regional library corporations. And as I understand it, that piece of the legislation will be enacted in July 2021. So what that will mean, I believe, is significant disruption for what is probably the original shared service within local government. So very proud heritage, proven, in my mind, model for efficiency and indeed innovation. I think we will see a number of regional library corporations look to different governance models, probably companies limited by guarantee, so under the beneficial enterprises part of the Act, which will see a reduction in red tape, I dare say, but I think also we have to be really careful as we work through this transition that we don't actually, I guess if you like, it could be quite expensive, so I think there's a risk around the cost to local governments or parts of library corporations having to bear the cost of transition. I think we need to have a conversation about that, and I think we have an obligation to the heritage that's been created through regional library corporations to make sure that what we end up with is better than what we had, rather than regression.
And perhaps that's a topic for another conversation. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
And on that note, I think we need to wrap it up there. Thank you, Kathryn. Chris and Kate, thank you very much for your time today, and all the very best as you continue to navigate through these strange and choppy waters that we have with us at the moment.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Farewell.
Appreciate your time. We've been talking about public libraries and the response to COVID-19 and a whole raft of issues that perhaps you hadn't considered in the way that you access your library during these times. Thanks to Kate Torney from State Library Victoria, Chris Buckingham from Public Libraries Victoria, and of course Kathryn Arndt from the VLGA. That's all for today. Look out for new episodes of VLGA Connect coming your way soon. And if you'd like to let us know about a story for a possible future episode, drop us an email to vlga@vlga.org.au. Bye for now.